This video was brought to you by Henson Shaving. Earlier this week, the EU's 27 commissioners began negotiating the EU's next budget. This is always a contentious process, but it's proving especially difficult this time round, because the EU needs to decide how it's going to pay back the 300 billion euros it's spent so far via the COVID Recovery Fund, which was funded by bonds issued by the European Union itself, rather than the individual member states. So in this video, we're going to explain why this is such a difficult problem for the EU, why it could pave the way for an EU tax, especially if the EU issues more joint debt to support Ukraine without the US in the future, and why history suggests that this would put the EU on a path towards a more federal structure, like in the US. We're getting remarkably close to 1 million subscribers, and currently 72% of you haven't yet subscribed. So lend us a hand and subscribe today. So let's start by explaining what actually happened with the EU's COVID Recovery Fund. Today, the EU is mostly funded via financial contributions from its member states, with the biggest and wealthiest countries contributing the most. When the pandemic struck, however, member states needed urgent financial support, but the EU didn't really have enough spare cash to help, and it couldn't ask member states for more contributions. After unsuccessfully trying a whole load of other things, including support from the European Central Bank and reviving the European Stability Mechanism, the instrument used for the Eurozone bailouts, in May 2020, the EU announced that it will be providing up to 650 billion euros in grants and loans that will be funded by joint borrowing at the EU level. In other words, the EU announced that it, not member states, would borrow the 650 billion euros on international markets, and then disperse that money to countries struggling with the pandemic. The programme was called Next Generation EU, and the instrument that actually borrowed the money was called the Recovery and Resilience Facility, or RRF. Now, it's hard to stress how unprecedented all of this was. While the EU has engaged in some joint borrowing in the past, the European Investment Bank and ESM, for instance, can both borrow money on international markets. The sums involved were always way smaller, and there was always a clear sense of how the debt would actually be paid back. With the RRF, though, not only are the sums involved pretty massive, over 300 billion euros has been dispersed already, but there wasn't a clear sense of how this would all be paid back, especially the 359 billion euros worth of grants. And for context, the EU's entire annual budget for 2025 is less than 200 billion euros. Anyway, the EU is due to start paying these off in 2028, which is why it's the big issue in the ongoing budget negotiations for the EU's next spending period, running from 2028 to 2034. Originally, the Commission proposed using tariffs, levies on carbon emissions, and a new tax on the profits of multinationals, which could all be levied by the EU. But this didn't work, largely because member states have decided that they want the proceeds of these taxes to go into their national coffers instead. The next option was to pay it off by increasing member contributions by about 15%, but this would be politically controversial and perhaps unfeasible if the EU engages in further joint borrowing before 2028, which looks increasingly likely. Mario Draghi's celebrated EU competitiveness report, for instance, called for further joint borrowing to fund investments in productivity and renewable energy, which will become increasingly tempting if a Trump trade war puts even more strain on the European economy. But perhaps more pressingly, the fact that Europe will probably have to guarantee Ukraine's security without America could well push the EU to more joint borrowing. Trump has already made it clear that he wants to end the war in Ukraine, and that the US will play no role in guaranteeing Ukraine's security afterwards. This puts all of the responsibility on the EU, but it'll be expensive. Zelensky, for instance, claims that an effective European peacekeeping force would require at least 100,000 troops on the ground in Ukraine, only slightly smaller than the current size of the entire UK armed forces. And Bloomberg Economics estimates that it would cost an astonishing 3 trillion euros over 10 years, including the cost of bolstering Europe's national militaries. This represents an eye-watering 15% of Europe's GDP. And will put an utterly enormous strain on national budgets that could be further exacerbated if Trump puts recession-inducing tariffs on the EU. This would make the idea of further joint borrowing way more attractive, especially because the EU could currently borrow at lower rates than most member states can. So if there is further joint borrowing, how will the EU actually pay it back? Well, if they can't force massive increases in member state contributions, the EU might resort to a direct tax. Now, this might sound ridiculously unlikely, given the widespread antipathy towards the EU at the moment, but it's not impossible. Paradoxically, the EU skeptic sentiment might encourage member states to endorse an EU tax, because they could then blame it on Brussels. But more importantly, letting the EU tax directly would immediately bring down EU borrowing costs, which are currently slightly higher than those of Germany, because investors will be more confident of the EU's tax-raising abilities. Similar dynamics drove the widespread adoption of the euro at the end of the 20th century. While a single currency seemed pretty much inconceivable as late as the 80s, when countries realised that merely stating their intention to join the euro brought their borrowing costs down, because markets assumed that euro countries would have to meet stringent fiscal criteria and enjoy the support of the European Central Bank, they were quick to sign up. Similarly, if member states realised that giving the EU the power of taxation, which currently lies exclusively with the member states, can ease debt burdens, they might be tempted, especially if they have to borrow trillions for Ukraine. This would also fit a long-running historical pattern. Crisis forces some central authority to act as a borrower of last resort, and then in the process of repaying the debts, breeds deeper political union, because taxpayers want more influence in how their money is spent. This is what happened in America and Germany, both federal systems that evolved out of confederations of independent states. At America's founding in 1776, the federal government, then the Continental Congress, had no powers of taxation, and, like in the EU today, relied entirely on contributions from member states. Americans just didn't like the idea of a strong central government, but during the War of Independence, the Continental Congress had to step in as a borrower of last resort to fund the war effort, and then had to assume tax-raising powers to pay off these debts, paving the way for a political union. Similarly, before the First World War, Germany was a patchwork of at least semi-independent states, and the Reich, essentially the federal government, had limited tax-raising powers, mostly involving tariffs. The First World War forced the Reich to step in as the borrower of last resort, and then assume the power of direct taxation in the interwar years. Now, to stress, we're not saying that this is definitely going to happen. Rather, the point we're trying to make is that the EU's decision to step in as the borrower of last resort follows a well-worn historical pattern that usually ends with deeper political union. To some extent, this is how the EU has always worked. Successive crises have pushed it, step by step, towards the ever closer union originally envisaged by the Treaty of Rome in 1957, which first established the EEC. Lots of people actively don't like shaving. After all, it's expensive, with brands selling overpriced razor cartridges filled with useless technology. And even if you do pay for all of that stuff, you're often left with a bad experience. Razor burn, ingrown hairs, and irritation. That's a problem that Henson Shaving have aimed to solve with their razor, one that's actively designed to protect your skin. In fact, Henson razors are better for 3 reasons. Firstly, Henson's AL13 razor, which they produce at their aerospace machine shop, holds blades at a perfect 30-degree angle, extending the blade only 0.0013 inches past the shave plane. That's less than the thickness of a human hair, and ensures that the blade is supported properly, unlike many other companies' blades, which in turn makes sure that you have a far better shave for your skin. Secondly, they're just cheaper. Those fancy blade cartridges are full of single-use junk, which makes each individual blade vastly more expensive than it has to be. Henson's razor takes totally standard blades, which cost just a few cents, which means that you can save money and can afford to replace your blades more often, so that you don't need to keep dragging a dull razor across your face just to try and get value out of that overpriced plastic. Speaking of plastic, those other cartridges certainly aren't good for the environment either, with 2 billion razor cartridges thrown away every year in the US alone. That's not true of Henson's blades though, which contain 0 plastic, even in their packaging. If you want to try it out, then click the link in the description, add a razor and 100 blades to your cart, and then once you've done that, use our discount code TLDR at checkout, and you'll get all of those blades absolutely free. Using our link and our code also means that they know that you came from us, which really helps us out.